Okay, let's talk about finding some solid ground in a world that feels, well, increasingly shaky sometimes.
Especially when it comes to figuring out what's right and wrong. Yeah.
Exactly. What if you could find a principle, like a really certain one, something true for anyone, anywhere, always?
That search for certainty in morals, it's an old quest. And our deep dive today, it takes us right to one of the biggest names who tackled it,
Immanuel Kant.
Immanuel Kant, and his a pretty revolutionary 1785 work, Fundamental Principles of the Metaphysic of Morals. We're looking at some key bits from that.
And this text, it isn't just, important. It really did kind of rewrite the rules for thinking about morality. So our mission today,
Yeah, what are we trying to do?
we want to cut through some of the, let's be honest, density and pull out the core ideas, like what Kant thinks is the only truly good thing.
The goodwill.
Right. And how duty shows us what morality really is, why he's so insistent that it's all about reason, not feelings, or what happens next.
And we have to talk about the categorical imperative, of course.
Definitely. And touch on that tricky but essential idea of freedom, too. Think of this as maybe your shortcut to getting a handle on some really foundational philosophy.
Sounds good. Let's unpack it.
Okay, so Kant just jumps right in with this pretty bold statement. He says the only thing good without qualification is a good will.
Right. And that sounds simple, but think about what it excludes. He looks at all the other stuff we normally call good.
Like being smart,
Yeah.
or brave,
What?
or rich, even being happy.
Exactly. Intelligence, wit, courage, persistence, wealth, health, happiness. He says these are only good with qualification.
Meaning, they depend on something else.
They depend on the will using them. Because, think about it, they can be used for terrible things, right?
Yeah. He mentioned the coolness of a villain.
Perfect example. A smart, brave villain is actually more dangerous. Their intelligence and courage aren't good in that case. They just make the evil will more effective.
So those qualities only become good if the will behind them is good.
Precisely. But a good will, that's different. It's good in itself. Its value doesn't come from whether it succeeds or fails, even if it achieves nothing. Yeah. Kant has this image. Even if a good will, maybe because of bad luck, special disfavor of fortune, or just lacking the means, couldn't actually achieve its goals.
But it still has value.
Its worth would shine like a jewel, he says. The goodness is in the willing itself, not the result.
Okay, that's a strong claim. And it leads him to this interesting idea about why we have reason, if it's not primarily to make us happy.
Which, let's face it, sometimes reason seems to do the opposite, doesn't it? Makes us aware of problems. Kant even mentions misology. A hatred of reason can come from this.
Right. Instinct might be better for just pursuing happiness. So if not happiness, what's reason's main practical job?
For Kant, its true purpose is exactly this: to produce a will that is good in itself. Reason's highest practical function isn't chasing happiness, it's guiding the will to be good.
And that's where duty comes in.
Exactly. Duty is where this idea of the good will becomes clearer, especially when our desires or inclinations might be pulling us somewhere else.
Okay, this next bit feels crucial. He makes a distinction between acting from duty.
Versus merely acting in conformity with duty.
And only acting from duty has real moral worth.
That's the core of it for Kant, yes. It's the only way an action gets that special status of being truly morally good.
Okay, I think I get the concept, but it still feels a little abstract. Maybe we can use his examples.
Definitely. His examples are designed precisely to make this clear. Let's take the honest shopkeeper.
Okay, the merchant charges fair prices.
Right. Is that the right thing to do? Yes. Is it in conformity with duty? Yes. But why does he do it?
Well, maybe just because it's good for business.
Yeah.
Keeps customers happy, builds reputation.
Exactly. Often it's just smart business sense. That's acting out of prudence or self-interest, which is a kind of inclination. It's not acting from duty.
So even though he does the right thing, Kant says it lacks true moral worth.
Correct, because the motive wasn't respect for the duty itself, but calculation or inclination.
Wow. Okay, that feels tough. What about, say, preserving your own life? Isn't that a duty?
It is, but most people have a very strong inclination to stay alive, right?
Right.
A powerful desire.
Yeah, naturally.
So if you preserve your life just because you want to live, just following that inclination, Kant says, again, no special moral worth, you're just doing what you desire. But imagine someone whose life is filled with despair. Maybe they've lost all hope, they actually wish for death.
Okay.
Yet, despite wishing for death, they preserve their life solely because they recognize it as their duty.
Ah, the person he describes as strong in mind indignant at his fate.
Yes. That action, preserving life against inclination purely from duty, that reveals the goodwill. That has moral worth.
Okay, I see the contrast. What about helping others? Beneficence?
Similar logic. If you help people because you have a naturally sympathetic personality or because it makes you feel good or you just enjoy spreading cheer.
That's nice, isn't it? Praiseworthy.
Absolutely. Kant agrees it's amiable and praiseworthy. But he argues it still lacks the highest moral worth.
Why? That seems really counterintuitive. Helping someone because you care seems good.
It is good in a way, but for Kant, the true moral benchmark comes when you help simply from duty. Imagine someone who, maybe by temperament, is cold, or perhaps they're overwhelmed by their own sorrows and feel no natural sympathy for others at that moment.
Okay.
If that person helps someone else, not out of any inclination, but purely because they recognize it as their duty.
That's the action with true moral worth for him.
Exactly, because the action springs solely from respect for the moral law, independent of any feeling or inclination.
So Kant is really isolating the reason for the action as the only thing that matters for moral value. Not the feeling, not the outcome, just the principle.
Precisely. It's about the purity of the motive.
What about trying to be happy? Is seeking our own happiness ever a duty?
Well, it's sort of an indirect duty, because being really unhappy and discontented can make you tempted to violate other duties, you know?
Sure, if you're miserable, maybe you're more likely to cut corners or lash out.
Right. But mostly we seek happiness out of a really strong inclination. And Kant points out, there's no single clear rule for how to achieve happiness. It's too vague, depends too much on individual circumstances and desires.
The counsels of prudence, he calls them, like general advice, not strict rules.
Exactly. They're based on experience, they're uncertain. And sometimes chasing a particular pleasure, like his example of the gouty patient enjoying rich food, can even undermine your overall well-being. So actions aimed at happiness usually come from inclination, not a clear command of duty.
So wrapping up this part on duty, the real takeaway is that moral worth isn't in what you achieve or how you feel about it. It's all in the maxim.
Yes, the subjective principle of your volition, the reason you're acting, specifically acting from duty.
And this involves a special kind of feeling.
Yes, what he calls respect for the law. It's not like fear or desire. It's a unique feeling, he says, produced by reason itself when we recognize the moral law as absolutely binding on us. Duty, then, is the necessity of acting out of this pure respect.
Okay, but this standard acting purely from duty, with absolutely no contamination from self-interest or inclination, it feels incredibly high.
It is.
I mean, in real life, can we ever be totally 100% sure that any action we do or anyone else does is purely from duty? Couldn't there always be some hidden self-love mixed in?
Kant absolutely admits this difficulty. He says even with the most rigorous self-examination, we can never be completely certain that some secret impulse of self-love wasn't lurking beneath the surface, maybe even disguised as the motive of duty.
So observers might doubt true virtue even exists.
He acknowledges that. A cool observer looking at human behavior might easily become skeptical about whether pure virtue ever actually motivates anyone because our motives are often so mixed and we're good at rationalizing.
But if we can't be sure about the motive, doesn't that undermine the whole project? How can we judge actions?
Well, for Kant, the crucial point isn't about empirical verification of motives. It's about establishing the standard itself. The idea of what makes an action morally worthy must be pure, even if we struggle to live up to it perfectly or verify it perfectly in practice.
And this is why he insists morality can't be based on experience or studying how humans actually behave. Anthropology.
Exactly that. Because experience only tells us what is. It shows us how people do act, with all their mixed motives and inclinations. It doesn't tell us how they ought to act with absolute necessity.
Morality needs necessity.
Moral laws, for Kant, have to be absolutely necessary. They must hold for all rational beings everywhere unconditionally. You can't get that kind of necessity from observing human behavior, which is always contingent, always depends on circumstances.
So experience gives us is, but morality needs ought.
A necessary ought, and that's why he argues for a pure moral philosophy, a metaphysic of morals.
Separate from the empirical part of ethics.
Yes. He sees ethics as having two parts. There's an empirical part, what he calls practical anthropology, studying human nature as it affects morality. But crucially, there must also be a rational, pure part, completely a priori, based only on reason. This is the metaphysic of morals.
Just like logic is pure, or physics has a rational mathematical part.
Precisely. And he's really quite strong on this point. He warns against mixing the pure principles with empirical considerations, like in what he calls popular philosophy. He thinks it corrupts morality.
Corrupts it. How?
By diluting the purity of the moral law. He has this great metaphor. You end up substituting for true morality a bastard patched up from limbs of various derivation.
Ouch. So keeping it pure is essential.
Because the whole authority and supreme worth of moral principles comes from their origin in pure reason a priori. We need this pure metaphysics established first, before we even think about applying it to messy human reality. It's the foundation.
Okay, so if morality applies to all rational beings, let's define that. What makes something a rational being for Kant?
Fundamentally, it's the capacity to act according to the conception of laws or principles. In other words, they have a will.
The will is practical reason.
Essentially, yes. It's the faculty we have to determine ourselves to act based on principles or laws that reason recognizes. Now, for a perfectly rational being, like maybe an angel or what Kant calls a holy will.
Their will just automatically does what reason says. No struggle.
Exactly. Their volition is necessarily in line with reason's laws. There's no gap, no temptation.
That's not us.
Definitely not us humans. Our will is imperfect. We have inclinations, desires, emotions that often pull us away from what reason tells us is right.
So for us, reason's principles aren't just descriptions, they're commands.
Precisely. They show up as commands, telling our imperfect will what it ought to do to align with reason. And these commands are expressed as imperatives.
Imperatives, okay. And Kant says there are two main types.
Yes. The first type are hypothetical imperatives.
Hypothetical, meaning conditional.
Exactly. They command an action as a means to achieve something else that you want or might want. They always have an if-then structure, even if it's implicit. If you want X, then you ought to do Y.
And he breaks these down further.
Into two kinds, yeah. Imperatives of skill are about achieving some possible end. If you want to be a good doctor, you ought to study anatomy. If you want to build a sturdy bridge, you ought to learn engineering principles. The command depends on you actually wanting that specific goal.
Makes sense. And the other kind?
Imperatives of prudence. These relate to an end we can assume pretty much everyone actually does want. Happiness.
So prudence is like skill in choosing the means to be happy.
That's right. Advice like save money, eat healthy, be kind to others. These can be seen as prudent ways to promote your own well-being. But notice, they are still hypothetical.
Why? Isn't happiness something we all want?
We do, but the action is still commanded as a means to that end. Happiness, not for its own sake. And Kant also argues that happiness is such a vague, indefinite concept. What makes one person happy makes another miserable. And it changes over time that reason can't actually give us definite, universal commands for achieving it. It's more based on experience and imagination.
So hypothetical imperatives are always means to an end, conditional. Morality needs something else.
It needs the categorical imperative. This is the second type and the only one that works for morality.
Categorical, meaning unconditional, absolutely.
Exactly. It commands an action immediately as necessary in itself without reference to any further goal or consequence. It just says, do X, period. Or perhaps you ought to do X, no ifs attached.
This is the kind of command that can be a moral law.
Yes, because only a categorical imperative has that absolute universal necessity that moral laws require. It binds all rational beings, regardless of their personal desires or goals. Kant notes it's a tricky thing to explain an a priori synthetical practical proposition, which is a mouthful.
Okay, let's not get bogged down in the technical term just yet. How do we know what this categorical imperative tells us to do? If it's not based on an outcome, what is it based on?
Well, since it's purely formal, not tied to any specific goal, the only thing left is the very form of lawfulness itself, universality. The command must be about whether the principle of your action could hold universally.
Which leads us directly to the first formula.
It does. Act only on that maxim whereby thou canst at the same time will that it should become a universal law.
Okay, let's break that down. Maxim is my personal rule. The principle I'm acting on in this situation.
Exactly, your subjective principle.
Yeah.
And the test is, can you rationally will that this personal rule become an objective law, binding on everyone, everywhere?
He also phrases it slightly differently sometimes, right? About nature.
Yes, the universal law of nature variant. Act as if the maxim of thy action were to become by thy will a universal law of nature. Imagine your rule suddenly became like a law of physics.
Okay, let's try this test on those examples again. Suicide to escape suffering. The maxim is, from self-love, I'll end my life when it promises more pain than pleasure.
Now, imagine that's a universal law of nature. The very feeling whose job is to preserve life, self-love,
Right.
would now have a universal function to destroy life under certain conditions.
That seems contradictory. A system where the drive to preserve leads to destruction.
Kant says it's a contradiction. You couldn't even conceive of such a system coherently. So that maxim fails the test. It violates a strict or perfect duty.
What about the lying promise? Maxim, when I need money and can't repay, I'll promise to repay anyway.
Universalize that. If everyone made promises they intended to break whenever it was convenient.
Then no one would believe promises anymore. The whole practice of promising would collapse.
Exactly. The maxim, if universalized, destroys the very institution it relies on. Another contradiction in conception. Another violation of a strict duty.
Okay, those seem clear contradictions. What about neglecting your talents? Maxim, I have abilities, but I'll just let them rust and focus on enjoyment.
No. Could you conceive of a world, a state of nature, where everyone just chills out and doesn't develop their talents?
Yeah, maybe like those South Sea Islanders Kant mentions. Humanity could technically still exist in a lazy state. So, it's conceivable.
It is conceivable. But now, the second part of the test. Could you rationally will this to be a universal law? As a rational being, Kant argues, you necessarily will that your faculties be developed, because they're the means to achieve all sorts of possible ends you might have.
So, willing universal laziness would contradict my own rational nature, which inherently wills the development of means to ends.
Precisely. You can conceive it, but you can't will it without contradicting your own rational will. This violates what Kant calls a laxer, meritorious, or imperfect duty.
Okay, and the last one. Not helping others. Maxim, let everyone fend for themselves. I won't help others in need, nor will I expect help.
Again, can you conceive of a world like that? Maybe. A harsh world, but perhaps possible.
But could you will it?
Kant says no, because you know that you yourself might at some point need the help of others. To will universal indifference would be to will away the possibility of receiving aid yourself, which contradicts the will's own necessary desire for self-preservation and well-being when in need.
So another imperfect duty. Conceivable, but not willable without contradiction.
Exactly. So this universalization test checking for contradictions either in conception, strict duties, or in willing, laxer duties, is the first big way Kant spells out the content of the categorical imperative.
That's a powerful tool for thinking about actions.
Oh, yeah.
Now, you mentioned Kant also approaches this from a different angle based on value.
Yes. He argues that for there to be an unconditional command, a categorical imperative, there must be something that has absolute worth, something valuable not just as a means to something else, but as an end in itself.
And what has this absolute worth?
Rational beings. Humanity, in his terms, whether in your own person or in others, we aren't just tools or resources. We have inherent dignity because we are rational agents capable of setting our own goals.
And this leads to the second formula.
It does, and it's maybe the most intuitively appealing one. So act is to treat humanity, whether in thine own person or in that of any other, in every case as an end withal, never as means only.
Never merely as a means. We use people as means all the time, right? Like a cashier or a bus driver.
Of course. The key is never as means only. You must also respect their status as an end in themselves, as a rational being with their own goals and dignity.
How does this apply to the examples? Suicide.
You're treating your own person, your humanity, merely as a means to escape a painful condition. You're discarding your rational nature to avoid suffering, failing to respect it as an end in itself.
The lying promise.
You're clearly using the person you lie to merely as a means to get money. They cannot possibly share the end of your action since they're being deceived. You're bypassing their rational consent.
Neglecting talents.
Here, you're not actively using yourself as a mere means, but you are failing to advance humanity as an end in itself within your own person. You're failing to promote the development of rational capacities, which have inherent worth.
And not helping others.
You're failing to actively support the ends of others. Since other rational beings are ends in themselves, their legitimate goals and projects should, as far as possible, be treated as our own ends too. Failing to help is failing to respect and promote humanity as an end in others.
This formula really emphasizes respect and dignity. It feels very humanistic.
It does. It provides a different, perhaps more concrete way to think about our moral obligations.
And there's a third main idea related to the will itself.
Yes, the third formula, which flows from the others. It's the idea of the will of every rational being as a universally legislative will.
Universally legislative, meaning giving laws for everyone.
Yes, but crucially, giving the law to itself. This is the principle of autonomy.
Autonomy means self-law.
Exactly. The will isn't just subject to the moral law. The moral law arises from the will's own rational legislative nature. True moral commands must come from within reason itself.
As opposed to heteronomy.
Right. Heteronomy is when the will gets its law from something outside itself. Like an inclination, I'll do this because I desire it, or an expected outcome, I'll do this to achieve happiness, or even an external authority, like God's commands, if viewed simply as external commands you obey out of fear or hope of reward.
So only autonomy, the will, giving itself the universal law through reason, can ground a truly categorical, unconditional imperative, because it's free from any external interest or condition.
That's Kant's argument. The moral law binds us because it is the law of our own rational will.
And if you put all this together, rational beings who are ends in themselves, each legislating universally through their own reason.
You get the idea of a kingdom of ends.
A kind of ideal rational community.
Yes, a systematic union of all rational beings under common, objective laws, laws which they themselves have created through their autonomy. In this ideal community, everyone treats themselves and everyone else always as an end, and recognizes themselves as both author and subject of the moral law. Duty applies to all members equally.
So to recap the core, moral worth is in the maxim, the principle, specifically acting from duty out of respect for the law. This law is the categorical imperative, testable by universalization, demanding respect for humanity as an end, and ultimately grounded in the will's own autonomous, self-legislating reason.
That's a great summary. And the absolutely essential underpinning for all of this, especially autonomy, is the concept of freedom.
Right. Without freedom, how could the will give the law to itself?
Exactly. Kant defines freedom in the practical sense as the will's ability to be effective, to cause things independently of foreign causes determining it, meaning not being simply pushed around by external stimuli or internal desires and inclinations.
So physical necessity being determined by prior causes is heteronomy. Freedom is autonomy.
Yes. Freedom is the will being its own cause, operating according to laws it gives itself through reason. And this leads Kant to a striking conclusion. A free will and a will subject to moral laws, the categorical imperative, are, he says, one and the same thing.
If you have a free will, you necessarily have a will under the moral law, and vice versa.
That's the claim. If freedom is presupposed, morality, in the form of the categorical imperative, autonomy, necessarily follows.
Okay, but why should we presuppose freedom? How do we know we're free?
Kant's move here is interesting. He argues that we must presuppose freedom for any rational being with a will insofar as it acts practically. Because reason, when it considers what ought to be done, cannot think of itself as being directed from the outside.
When I rationally decide to do something, I experience myself as the source of that decision, not just a puppet of my desires.
Precisely. Reason must regard itself as the author of its own principles, independent of alien influences. Therefore, practical reason must regard itself as free. Acting under the idea of freedom is enough, he suggests, for the moral law to be binding on us. We don't need absolute proof of freedom first. We act as if free, and that's sufficient for morality.
Okay, acting under the idea of freedom. But earlier you mentioned a potential problem here. Doesn't it sound a bit like a circle?
Ah, yes, the apparent circle. It looks like this. We argue we're under moral laws because we think we're free, but then we argue we must be free because we feel bound by moral laws. Freedom and the moral law, autonomy, seem to justify each other, but where's the independent ground for either?
How does Kant get out of this circle?
He introduces his famous distinction between two standpoints, two ways of considering ourselves and the world.
The two worlds.
Exactly. First, the world of sense or phenomena. This is the world as it appears to us, the world of experience, governed by natural laws of cause and effect. From this perspective, all our actions, like everything else, seem determined by prior causes, our biology, psychology, environment. This is the realm of heteronomy.
We see ourselves as objects within nature.
Right. But second, there's the intelligible world, or noumena. This is the world conceived by reason, the world of things as they are in themselves, independent of how they appear to our senses. As rational beings, as intelligences with wills, we belong to this world too.
And in this intelligible world.
Here, our will is conceived as operating independently of the chain of natural causation. It acts according to laws of reason alone. This is the realm of autonomy and freedom.
So we belong to both worlds simultaneously.
Yes, and that's the key to breaking the circle and resolving the conflict between freedom and determinism. As a member of the intelligible world, as an intelligence, my will is fundamentally autonomous, aligned with reason's laws.
But I'm also in the world of sense.
And because I'm also part of the world of sense, subject to inclinations and natural causes, those laws of my true rational self in the intelligible world don't automatically determine my actions. Instead, they appear to my sensible self as an ought.
So the ought, the categorical imperative, is the law of my free, rational self in the intelligible world, commanding my empirically conditioned self in the world of sense.
That's exactly Kant's solution. The ought expresses the necessary connection between my intelligible self, which is free and autonomous, and my sensible self, which should conform to that freedom. It bridges the two standpoints.
And our own experience of moral conflict, feeling pulled between duty and desire, actually points to this dual nature.
He thinks so. The fact that we feel the force of the ought, even when it goes against our desires, the fact we value moral goodness even when we fail, shows that we implicitly recognize ourselves as belonging to that higher intelligible world where reason and the goodwill are the law.
That's a really intricate way to ground morality and freedom. But does Kant think we can fully explain how all this works?
And here we hit the wall. Kant is very clear about the limits of practical philosophy. While he believes he's shown that morality requires freedom and autonomy and how this relates to our dual nature,
He admits we cannot explain how pure reason can be practical, how freedom is actually possible.
precisely. We can't provide a causal explanation in the way we explain events in the world of sense for how a purely rational thought, the moral law, can motivate the will, or how the will can initiate action independently of the chain of natural causes, freedom.
Why not?
Because explanation, for Kant, relies on bringing things under laws that apply to possible experience. Freedom, belonging to the intelligible world, isn't an object of possible experience. It's a necessary idea of reason for practical purposes, but its mechanism, its possibility as a type of causality, is beyond our theoretical understanding.
We have to presuppose it for morality, but we can't explain it.
That's the gist. We also can't explain why the moral law interests us, why it has a grip on us. We feel its effect, moral feeling. But the interest arises because the law is valid for us as rational beings belonging to the intelligible world. We don't obey the law because it interests us. That would make it hypothetical again.
So the deepest questions about how freedom works and why morality motivates us remain mysterious.
Incomprehensible in terms of theoretical explanation. And Kant thinks recognizing this boundary, understanding the incomprehensibility of the ultimate ground of the categorical imperative, is the highest point practical philosophy can reach. It's all that can be fairly demanded. We grasp that it is binding, even if the ultimate how eludes us.
Wow, okay. That has been quite a deep dive. We went from the simple-sounding idea of the goodwill
As the only unqualified good,
through understanding duty as acting from principle, not just conforming to it,
to seeing why morality had to be based on pure reason, leading to the categorical imperative.
with its different formulations, universal law, treating humanity as an end, and the will's own autonomy in a kingdom of ends.
And connecting all of that to freedom, reconciled with determinism through the two standpoints, the world of sense and the intelligible world.
And finally, acknowledging the limits, the ultimate incomprehensibility of how reason commands us and how freedom is possible. It's a radical vision, isn't it? Tying morality entirely to our rational nature, independent of feelings, outcomes, or outside authorities.
Completely, it places immense responsibility on the rational agent.
So here's a final thought to ponder. Kant makes it clear how incredibly difficult it is to ever be truly certain that any action, even our own, is done purely from duty, without any speck of self-interest. And he admits we can't fully explain how this pure reason actually motivates us unconditionally.
Right, the empirical verification and the theoretical explanation both hit limits.
So given that difficulty and that limit, what does this really imply about the moral life? Is striving for virtue less about reaching a provable state of purity, and maybe more about constantly orienting ourselves towards this incredibly demanding rational ideal of duty and freedom, an ideal whose ultimate workings might always remain partly beyond our full grasp?